Israel and Iran are at war, and it's time to ask, should Europe have the courage to pick a side? It's 40 years of Schengen. Has open borders helped or hindered Europe? And in the UK, the shocking rape gang scandal has exploded again. Is there any lessons for Europe in this story of the brutal betrayal of young girls? So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. I am John O'Brien, Head of Communications, filling in for Jacob Reynolds for the next few weeks. Today, to unpack these issues, I'm delighted to be joined by Mick Hume, Editor-in-Chief with the EuropeanConservative.com, and Agnieszka Kolek, Head of Cultural Engagement with MCC Brussels. Thank you both for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Israeli strikes target Iranian military and nuclear assets after they made threats of annihilation. Iran backs Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and the key players in the October 7th pogrom. Europe mostly calls for restraint on all sides. Mick, to start with you, I'd like to ask you, do you think Europe's call for restraint creates a false moral equivalency between Israel and Iran?
Thanks, Sean. Yes, completely. In the meeting of European foreign ministers this week, apparently about half of them wanted to give some support to Israel and the other half didn't. So they end up doing more or less nothing. One of them said to Politico that the reason for this was that there's a difference between the right of Israel to self-defense and preemptive military strikes, which they said Israel had launched on Iran. In other words, this was aggression. Let's be quite clear that the aggressor in this situation is Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been sponsoring Israel's enemies on 7 fronts where they've been fighting wars, from Hamas to Hezbollah to the Houthis and everybody else in the region that's been fighting against Israel, and are 100% committed to the destruction of the Israeli state, with or without a nuclear bomb. That has been their practical policy for the last 30 years, not just a slogan. As their supreme leader says, when we say death to America and Israel, that's not a slogan, that's a policy. So Israel's response is entirely justified and entirely timely. And any European leader with anything about them should have come out 100% on the side of Israel.
How come here in the Brussels bubble, you don't hear that? What you've just said, you don't hear. What you hear is that it was preemptive.
Yeah, because this has not happened overnight. The betrayal of Israel by the European Brussels elites has been happening for years, and most graphically since October the 7th, where they have drawn that false equivalence between Hamas and Israel, and in fact have accused Israel of genocide in Gaza, when Israel are actually fighting a war against the genocidal death cult of Hamas, who are committed to killing Jews because they're Jews. And so this kind of Gaza through the looking glass view of events has been taking hold in Brussels over a long period of time, and this has kind of brought it to its head where now, at least in Gaza, the European left can pretend that their anti-Israeli and Jew-hating sentiments are really about defending civilians. They can say we're on the side of Palestinian civilians. The victims they want to defend now in Iran are the generals of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, an international terrorist organisation. So it brings out very clearly that what motivates them is anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic sentiment.
Agnieszka, I want to bring you in here. Should the European Union align more strongly with Israel through sanctions, security cooperation? Should we be there for Israel?
I think we should be. I agree here with Mick, but I also think I would point out that it's one thing is to support Israel because they have the right to defend themselves, but also looking at the security of Europeans, I think it's also vital for us. Iran has been known for taking part in action around the globe and also within Europe, where they linked with drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, assassinations. So this is also a matter that concerns us. Not to mention Iran working closely with Russia and globally also with China. So there's a lot of things at play. But the first one is definitely that they spread chaos through their proxies and all this kind of illegal activities.
Mm-hmm. Mick, how can European leaders preserve diplomatic credibility if they appear weak in defending a democratic ally?
Well, I think it's a moment. It's a key moment, John. When Netanyahu said, I wrote this in my editorial on EuropeanConservatives.com this week, when Netanyahu said this is a key moment in the history of Israel, it's also a decisive moment in the history of Europe and European politics. Whose side are you on in the global war for democracy? And if they have decided instead they want to be friends, they want to both make concessions to the Islamist lobby at home, which is a very powerful one in Europe now, and a very threatening one, as Agnieszka says, and would rather build their international relations with other parts of the world that are on the Islamist side, than standing with the only democracy in the Middle East and the only Jewish state on earth. I think that's a terrible indictment of the European leaders. And what it demonstrates is the point that J.D. Vance made to them at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, that you European leaders are continually talking now about defence, but what are you defending? And if you will not stand up for the only democracy in the Middle East, if you will not stand up against the global threat of Islamist terrorism, then why would you expect anybody to come and fight for you?
Agnieszka, is the narrative of defending civilization helpful or harmful in framing this conflict?
I think this is a helpful narrative. Obviously, this is on kind of like all-encompassing narrative. There are many other things at play, but I would have no doubt watching the events that unfolded on the 7th of October and other acts of terror around the world, that we are dealing with barbarism, even if there are elements where it's very sophisticated, well organized and so on. But this is barbarism, and this is nothing to do with what we consider civilization.
Mm-hmm. Mick, talk about which side are you on? Steve Bannon, Charlie Kirk, Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's a whole lot of Americans who were really committed to the non-interventionist line. And that's one of the reasons they backed Trump. They felt that he promised that. They're now saying that he sold them out, through the whatever involvement America's had in the action that Israel took, or whatever future involvement, they feel that they've been betrayed. Could you unpack that for us and tell us how we should think that through?
Well, it's a problematic relationship, as always, between the domestic politics of America and America's role in the world as the world policeman, and whether it should still maintain that or not. And there is clearly a divide in the MAGA camp. I think most Americans, most Trump supporters, would be perfectly happy with him bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. They certainly don't want American troops getting involved in the conflict. And I don't think the government does either. But I think, by the way, it's a remarkable testament to Israel that they've achieved such success in these conflicts on all fronts, and now against Iran, against all the predictions, even without the steadfast support of what was supposed to be their number one ally and sponsor in the world. Even the Americans have been very equivocal in their attitude to it. Trump has told them no, time and again. And in fact, now that Trump wants to is talking about possibly getting involved, or at least putting more pressure on Iran, it's mainly because, as far as we can tell, they have been shocked by the success the Israelis have had against the Iranian forces. So I think that interplay between American domestic politics and Israeli politics is very important. It's not like we want to come out and say, we insist that America invades Iran, because we know this is a disaster. The last 20 years is a long list of disastrous Western invasions and interventions in these countries. Overthrowing the regime in Iran has got to be the business of the Iranian people. And we can hope that this conflict can accelerate it, but I don't think it's up to Donald Trump or anybody else to do that. So in that sense, I understand the reluctance to get involved. But I think if America wants to be taken seriously still as the leader of the Western world, they've got to stand with Israel.
Agnieszka, is it different than asking America to be the world's policeman, that this particular situation, this particular conflict, this particular struggle with Iran has a qualitative difference, that America's help, and indeed Europe's help, in ending this terror everyone needs to step up?
I think it doesn't, in a sense. I would go back to the beginning of our conversations, where we see that it influences countries around the globe. This is not just local issue. So the influence of drug trafficking and terrorism, but then also the proxies that are being established in different countries. I was looking at a report published last year on the influence of Iranian proxies in Sweden, the crime in Sweden. So I'm sure if we looked closely at the data and the reports from around the world, it causes a lot of instability and chaos internally in individual countries. So definitely, I think we need to join the forces to cut the head of the snake.
Okay, thank you very much.
Iranian terrorists arrested for plotting to blow up the Israeli embassy in London.
Yes,
very recently. This is not a local issue.
We're all involved.
Yeah. Now, one thing that has happened in the last few days is because Israel has had far more success, a testament, they've had a very good week, whereas Europe's had a bad one, than was expected. Some of the European leaders have been trying to jump on the bandwagon and say, oh yes, of course we support Israel's right to defend themselves. And so I thought Merz, the German chancellor, had a rare moment of kind of letting the cat out of the bag like yesterday when he said, the Israelis are doing the dirty work for all of us. You think, well, on one hand, okay, that's coming out on Israel's side. On the other hand, what kind of European leaders are these who are hiding behind Israel's skirts in a global conflict against Islamism? So he might think he's taken the right side, but I think it's also quite revealing about the impotence of Europe in these major conflicts.
The Schengen Agreement, the foundational treaty on European integration, turns 40 years old this month. So 40 years after Schengen promised free movement across 27 countries, internal border checks are quietly returning. In places like Austria, Germany, and Sweden, they're reintroducing the checks, driven by fears of illegal migration, terrorism, and security gaps. Mick, can I begin with you in asking, is this a temporary retreat from open borders or the beginning of the end?
Well, I hope it's the beginning of the end. It's certainly the exposure of the myth, this kind of dream of an open Europe, that everything was going to be lovely, all the borders would be open, we'd all be dancing through the meadows of flowers together, without border police, and really, it will be, the Schengen Agreement will be hugely celebrated, I'm sure, on its 40th anniversary, and of course it's just been expanded with Romania and Bulgaria joining it earlier this year. So there's a tremendous kind of sense of this is the EU's major achievement. It's often said, but the disparity between that and the reality, as you indicate, John, is becoming stark, more and more clear. If you remember the kind of myth of the open borders EU, or the dream of the open borders EU, which, by the way, was always less about a love for migration than a hatred for national sovereignty and democracy. That's really why Brussels loved open borders, was because they wanted to put power in their hands rather than the hands of national governments to control borders. But it was supposed to be a fortress Europe on the outside and open borders instead. And of course, we now have neither of those things. We know that Europe is incapable of defending its borders externally. Indeed, it fines Hungary €1 million a day for attempting to defend the external borders of Europe against illegal migration, in defiance of the EU's migration pact. And internally, whilst it's great for tourists and it's good for trade and everything across borders, there are more and more concerns from Scandinavia to Germany itself about closing the borders, about having more border controls, because of the real but the real damage that's been done to European society by untrammeled mass migration and the lack of integration and the destruction of European culture.
Agnieszka, is it possible to protect borders while upholding human rights? Is there a balance between what we need to do to secure our countries, but also being open to others?
I have an impression that this is a wrongly phrased, maybe not question, but the way that the topic is framed, because protecting borders kind of implies that means you are unkind and you don't respect other humans, you don't respect people, where this is a completely different situation to when the Schengen area was established, and it was just 5 countries, and it was time still of the Cold War, and the border that was on the eastern side was very well protected from both sides, because no one wanted anyone to go anywhere to either of the sides. So then it was a completely different story how that could be managed and how this dream could be lived to what we have now, when it's 27 member states, and we have this huge external borders, then obviously with the geopolitical changes in the world, that influences the movement of the people. Then we also have the industrial complex of the NGOs, which actively help people smugglers. And this is not just about humanitarian aid for someone from a war-torn zone trying to claim the war refugee status. This is a constant influx of people that you cannot check. You don't know who they are. And as we were talking at the beginning of our conversation, Iran is also embedding their operatives in these people smuggling operations. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board and redefine these terms and not frame them in this black and white that if you want closed border, that means you don't uphold human rights and you are against people getting protection from war-torn places.
Mick, should the EU impose firmer rules for when borders are closed?
I don't think the EU should impose any rules. I think this should be in the hands of sovereign national governments.
Do you think that these people who've moved back from the open borders, the countries that have introduced some checks, do you think that the EU is going to come after them?
Well, I think that quite possibly, but it really depends who they are. I mean, all the evidence is that the EU operates its usual double standards in relation to these things. Hungary, as I say, gets fined €1 million a day for refusing to allow illegal immigrants across its border. Which, by the way, is an entirely humane policy. They said we accept asylum seekers, but we'll deal with them at the border, not let them in first and then talk to them about whether they'd like to leave. They get fined €1 million a day. Poland, under a very pro-Brussels government, is allowed to reinforce its eastern borders without any problem. So it's the usual Brussels double standards.
One rule for you, one rule for me.
It's not so much what's being done, but who's doing it. It's what matters. Well, I could just go back to the previous point you made, John. You see, when you talk about human rights, for me, in the European context especially, human rights always means judges' rights. And when we say that this becomes a matter for human rights, it means it comes under the control of the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, and they begin to decide who is and isn't allowed into various countries. And I think we've got to go back to basics and say, let's talk about the rights, the liberties, the national rights of sovereign nations and democratically elected governments to control their own border. Because if you do not have the right to control your own borders, you do not have sovereignty and you do not have national democracy. And so it's a fundamental issue for us, I think.
Yeah. Picking up on some of that, Agnieszka, how has migration shifted from a humanitarian issue to one about identity and sovereignty?
Mick already touched upon that, but I think somehow it looks like that the migration is not only used as a weapon from outside, as this kind of fifth column being introduced, but also internally. They're being used as a potential voter base that is growing the support for the left of center and to the far left parties. And they rely more and more on these votes. And also it supports the tendencies to create an authoritarian states where we seem to have democracy, but in order to keep us all safe and secure, we need to introduce the surveillance on every possible level of the society, from banking system to cameras everywhere, to all sorts of checks where there is no trust within the community anymore. And because there are atrocious things happening, from terror attacks, rapes, burglaries, robberies, more and more sophisticated, in a sense, part of the society starts to beg for these measures because they want to survive. And I think this is really dangerous trend.
It's a very interesting observation.
If we go back 25 years in the UK, Tony Blair's New Labour government, when they first started the policy of opening the borders and mass immigration, Blair's advisor said, we're going to rub the right's noses in diversity. Basically, we are going to weaponise migration as a tool to change this country and to reflect what we want it to be. And look at the consequences now in Britain with the rape gang scandals and all of these other things accumulating.
Grooming gangs targeted young girls in towns like Rotherham and Telford. Many victims were white, working class, and the perpetrators were Pakistani and from Muslim backgrounds. Authorities have been accused of ignoring evidence to avoid charges of racism, and now there's going to be an inquiry into it. Mick, has multiculturalism been misapplied in ways that help shield these crimes? Or is that oversimplified?
No, I don't think it's it's oversimplified only in the sense that I don't think multiculturalism has been misapplied. This is the consequence of multiculturalism. There's a very clear distinction we have to understand in a country like Britain. Britain is a multi-ethnic society and has been for a long time. A multicultural society, which has been institutionalized in the last 30 or 40 years, is something quite different. It's one that says all cultures are equal. There is no national identity. Nobody has to integrate or accept the standards established for the British people. All these communities can have their own identities and their own, basically, even their own laws in parts of the country where there are now Sharia courts operating in local communities. So that kind of division is what's led to this a culture amongst large numbers of Pakistani origin Muslim men in English towns and cities that treat non-Muslim white girls as slags, as trash. This is their language, as objects to be abused and used as they see fit because they're less than human. And the cover-up of that by the pro-multicultural authorities is an unprecedented scandal, I think, in British politics.
Agnieszka, did fears of being labelled racist prevent police and councils from acting sooner and acting decisively?
Yes, it did. But I also think there is an element of local politicians being involved in covering it up actively. And I think there were elements of, because there were friends of the friends or maybe family members involved, but there was also the issue about making sure that the voter base doesn't get upset. And now I think it's a very dangerous point where the inquiry was being announced that would take up to 3 years to be investigated and for the report to come out. And at the same time, in Britain, they're working on the definition of Islamophobia to be introduced, which would actually hamper the investigation being done properly, and then for the results of this investigation in the report to be published. Because one of the parts of this definition that was being discussed in 2019 for the first time, and then that was adopted by the Labour Party, by the Lib Dems, the Greens, SNP, and the Scottish Conservatives, was that talking about trying to discuss or talking about the prevalence of Pakistani Muslim perpetrators in this rape gangs across the country is a far-right trope and is Islamophobic. So this is really dangerous because actually it's not even that we're just trying to now deal with the failed policies of multiculturalism. No, they're digging in their heels. They're trying to create some kind of a make-pretend smokescreen for people to maybe just calm down because it will take 3 years. You will forget about it. We will all move on, while actually introducing something that would stop any investigation going deep enough and actually exposing the complicity of the police, of the social services, of the local councillors, and also of the national leaders. Mm-hmm. Because there were many reports being published. Not all of them were published fully to the public because they didn't want the public to see the results. Mm-hmm. So they also took part in that.
I mean, why should anybody trust the British Labour government and the British state to hold an investigation into its own crimes? I mean, the Labour councils in these towns. I remember this years ago when this started. Andrew Norfolk, a brilliant Times journalist who started this investigation, again, who, by the way, was a kind of Guardian reading liberal who didn't believe it himself, but when he looked at the facts, he discovered it was a very serious scandal going on. He was the first one to report this. The local authorities tried to go to the courts and use taxpayers' money to suppress his right to report the truth, and tried to get the British government to support them in court, and said this is the lies of the Murdoch press. That this is the Labour Party. Now, only weeks ago, every single Labour MP voted against a national inquiry. Yep. Keir Starmer said it's a right-wing a far-right bandwagon. Yep. And the other Labour minister went on national media and said this is dog whistle racist politics. Now we're supposed to believe that these people have converted to wanting the truth.
So my question to you, Mick, is what can be done to rebuild the public's trust in institutions after this massive betrayal of young, vulnerable girls?
Well, I don't think there'll be any rebuilding of the trust in the political establishment. I think the British political establishment is living on borrowed time, and I think the surge of support for Nigel Farage and reform is only just beginning, and that's the way the wind is blowing. And there will be other populist movements that come. So I think they are living on borrowed time. There has got to be a full prosecution of everybody involved in these cover-up. I say that with absolutely no
involved in this cover-up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not only the rape gangs, which are still operating, as Louise Casey points out in her report, they're still operating in these towns with impunity in many places. But all those people actively involved in the cover-up have got to be held to account. Now, I say that without any confidence whatsoever that it will happen. I think the inquiry will, as has been said, be a drawn-out extension of the cover-up as much as it's going to be exposure. Everybody knows the truth of what's going on.
That's a shame. Question for both of you. So this is not just a British problem. What lessons does this experience that happened in the UK, what lessons does it have for the greater European Union? In Cologne, on New Year's Eve in 2016, we had over 600 sexual assaults, 1,200 criminal complaints. Many of the suspects were from North African and Middle Eastern origin. In Sweden, the rising reports of sexual assault have been there for the last 20 years, and some Swedish police report that suggested that foreign-born individuals have been overly represented in the crime statistics. Other places don't gather the statistics. Is there something that we need to look at? And what are we talking about? Are we talking about religion? Are we talking about culture? Are we talking about something that is wrong that we need to have a conversation and an honest conversation about in Europe today?
I would actually start first from the safety and security of women. As a woman, I don't have time to talk about culture. First of all, I want women to feel safe. So I think there has to be more citizen journalism. We have to put pressure on the politicians. We need to support politicians that want to have honest reporting of ethnicity and religion of the perpetrators. We need to have proper statistics. In the book published by Ayaan Hirsi Ali in 2020, it was the first book that looked into this issue after the big wave of migrants came into Europe in 2015, the unprecedented wave. She found it difficult to find reliable statistics because all of the politicians that contributed to the situation, they make sure that things are not recorded properly. They were trying to follow the court proceedings in Germany, and it was very hard to go to the court proceedings because they kept changing the dates or the places. So I think, first of all, as a society, we have to put pressure on honest reporting, statistics, and then following through first with the safety of women, and then we can discuss the differences, but we might not like the results of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that entirely, and I think we hear a lot of talk about the need to uphold European values. Brussels is very big on this. Or here's a European value that we ought to uphold and insist upon in a civilized society: equality before the law. Absolute equality before the law, that everybody has got to be treated the same. And these people have got to be dealt with the same as any other sex criminal who was committing these kind of crimes. And we've got to have, in addition to that, we've got to have an open, honest discussion about everything. But nothing is off the table. You made the point, fear of being called racist. That's exactly right, John. They were afraid of being called racist. They were afraid of losing their Muslim supporters in these cities. And they were afraid that the English working class, the white working class, would go and burn down the mosques because that's the way that they think of the British working class. That's what they think they're like. So the Labour Party's contempt, fear of losing their Muslim supporters and contempt for the white working class meant they wanted to suppress everything. And what happens when you suppress these things is they just burst through the surface in a very ugly way. So we've got to have everything out open on the table. And we've got to insist to the political class, tell us the truth. Because if they don't, people are coming to replace them who will make that their slogan.
Mm-hmm. And I would add one more point to that, actually, because when you were talking, it reminded me that we also have to protect freedom of speech. Because when there are the cases that actually the statistics are being quoted by the upcoming politicians, by the citizens, by the victims, they are being prosecuted for saying the truth. So we go back to the basics. We have to protect freedom of speech because otherwise we're going to lose our lives and our values.
As always.
Lose Europe.
as always, freedom of speech is the most important liberty, and it's never the problem, and often possibly the solution.
Agnieszka, Kolek, Mick, Hume, thank you very much for joining us today and discussing these difficult issues and unpacking them for our viewers. And you, the viewers, like, subscribe, and please give us your comment. Give us your view. We're interested in hearing what you have to say. Join us again on another edition of the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm John O'Brien, signing off.